Everyone, and welcome to our final lecture for Introduction to Psychology. Today we are going to finish up our discussion on group differences and the question of bias in intelligence testing. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So in science, as is in everyday life, it's differences, not similarities, that tend to excite the most interest. People will often be like, "Oh, yeah, that's cool. We're similar." But it's whenever people are different that people really get up and be like, "Oh man," and get really excited to see differences. Now, whenever it comes to intelligence, the differences between men and women are minor, and this is best proven in a 1932 test of all Scottish 11-year-olds. In this test, it was found that girls' average intelligence score was about 100.6 and boys' average intelligence score was about 100.5. Not too far off of the average for this test score, and also not enough of a significant difference that it was anywhere near notable. So as far as general intelligence goes, boys and girls score about the same. However, there are some level of recorded differences. Girls tend to outperform at spelling, tend to be more verbally fluent, tend to be better at locating objects, tend to be better at detecting emotions, and tend to be more sensitive to things like taste, the color of an object, and touch. Now, boys outperform women at tests of spatial ability, and they tend to be better at complex math problems. Now, please keep in mind, this is complex math problems, not general math, not math in general. Whenever it comes to general math computation and overall math performance, girls and boys hardly differ whenever it comes to these. A girl will perform just as well as a boy on a test of addition, subtraction, basic algebra, things like that. But whenever it comes to things like complex math, like, I don't know, theoretical physics, like theoretical calculus, it tends to show that boys do tend to perform better. Now, here's the question. Here's the chicken and the egg question. Some chalk up these differences to ancestral patterns of behavior. Women may be better at locating objects because they were foragers as ancestors. Boys may outperform tests of spatial ability because they were hunters because they had to know the 3D shapes of things be able to turn those 3D shapes to be able to do things like firing arrows and things like that. So, is the question lying in ancestral patterns of behavior, or is the result of modern influence the reason why we have these recorded differences? An example, by the way, those who play action video games regularly have a boosted spatial ability. And by spatial ability, we mean the ability to think of an object as a 3D object and turn it in your mind. Now, one more factor of this is cultural and social expectations, because these may also influence group differences whenever it comes to gender. They may influence things like life priorities, risk-taking behaviors, interest in math, reasoning, and spatial abilities. These differences are things that are urged to us to remember that these social expectations and divergent opportunities could be shaping boys and girls' interests and abilities. Gender-equal cultures, for example, like Sweden and Iceland, exhibit little of the gender math gap that's found in gender-unequal cultures like Turkey or Korea. Now, whenever it comes to racial and ethnic differences in intelligence, there's two findings we have to contend with. First is that the racial groups do differ in their average intelligence scores. Secondly is that high-scoring groups are more likely to attain higher levels of education and income. So, now there's many differences group differences in average intelligence scores, and such group differences do provide little basis for judging individuals on. For example, most Japanese individuals outscore Barakumen, which is a stigmatized Japanese minority. European-descended New Zealanders outscore native Maori New Zealanders. White Americans have outscored Black Americans, although this difference has diminished recently, especially amongst children, so it's not entirely valid to bring it up here. But such group differences provide little basis for judging individuals. Now, we've seen that heredity contributes to individual differences in intelligence, and that's the important word, individual. Group differences in a heritable trait may just be entirely environmental, not genetic. Although individual performance differences may be substantially genetic, group differences are not. The other thing to keep in mind is that race is not a neatly defined biological category for us. The average genetic difference between two Iceland villagers or between two Kenyans greatly exceeds genetic differences. It exceeds the group genetic difference between Icelanders and Kenyans. Light-skinned Europeans and dark-skinned Africans are generally closer than dark-skinned Africans and dark-skinned Aboriginal Australians. Race means nothing whenever it comes to how similar or how different someone is genetically. Another thing to keep in mind is that most social scientists see race as a social construct without well-defined physical boundaries. Most social scientists see race as a social construct. People with varying ancestry may categorize themselves in the same race. Moreover, with increased mixed ancestries, more and more people defy this neat categorization of racial identity and self-identify as multiracial. They will identify with multiple racial groups. So it's important for us to keep in mind that race isn't something that's neatly defined. We can't just point to somebody and be like, oh yeah, you're white, you are African American, you're Asian, you're Hispanic. It's not as simple as that, whether it is biologically or socially. It's not that simple. Data supports the view that cultural differences in the provision of information may actually account for racial differences in IQ. Countries whose economies create a large wealth gap between those who are rich and those poor also tend to have a large IQ gap between these two groups. Educational policies can also predict national differences in intelligence and knowledge tests. Those who have educational policies like kindergarten attendance or a longer instructional time per year, different varieties of school discipline, will potentially have higher scores than somebody who doesn't have these things in place. One thing to consider is a national study that's looked over the mental test performance of white and African American young adults after graduating from college. Whenever it comes to differences in something as small of a difference as a school, from 8th to 12th grade, the average aptitude score for a white student increased, while those for African American students decreased. But during college, African American college students scored, they increased 4 times more than those of white college students. This could be because both white and African American college students are in environments of comparable quality compared to the varied quality of different high schools. Now, this comes down to the question of bias. If one assumes that race is a meaningful concept whenever it comes to intelligence, then the debate will divide down to 3 main arguments. There are genetically disposed race differences in intelligence, there's socially influenced race difference in intelligence, or there's race differences in test scores, but those tests are inappropriate or biased. We've seen that the genetic differences do not dispose differences in race for intelligence. So far, Our evidence researching from experimental research is that this is not the case at all. Socially influenced race differences may have more of a leg to stand on, but again, this is something that we are not certain of yet. Now, here's a question. Are race differences in test scores simply because the test itself is biased? This answer of whether or not intelligence tests are inappropriately biased depends on the definition of bias we use. We consider a test to be biased if the test detects not only innate differences in intelligence, but also performance differences caused by cultural experiences. This is the first real definition for bias whenever it comes to testing. This is the popular definition. In the popular sense of the word, intelligence tests are biased. They measure developed abilities which in part reflect your education and experiences. For example, some test questions could make assumptions that the reader is middle class. Asking if things go together, asking a question like, does the cup go with the saucer, is going to be something that is more easily answered by someone who has had a middle class or a high class experience. If so, are these tests a vehicle for discrimination? Defenders of existing aptitude tests note that these racial group differences persist on nonverbal items too, things like counting backwards. Some question if blaming the tests for a group's lower score isn't akin to blaming the messenger for bad news. Should we blame the test for the results that we're finding? Should we blame the test for exposing unequal experiences and opportunities? Now, the second meaning of bias, its scientific meaning, is very different from this. This type of bias hinges on a test's validity, on whether it predicts future behaviors only for some groups of test takers. In this way, the major U.S. aptitude tests aren't biased. The test's predictive validity is roughly the same for men and women, between white and African American people, and between rich and poor people. They will predict to the same degree of validity future performance. Now, the test would be biased if it only predicted well only women, or it would be biased if it predicted only white people's future scores well. But usually it will predict regardless of if the person is a man or a woman, if the person is white or African American, or if the person is rich or poor. Now, what can cause issues whenever it comes to testing and is important to discuss is one's expectations and attitudes, which can influence our perceptions and behaviors even unconsciously. A 1997 study by Stephen Spencer and his colleagues gave women a difficult math test to both men and women. Women did not do as well, except for when they had been led to expect that women usually do as well as men on this test. Similarly, this finding has been observed with Black students. When reminded of their race before taking their verbal aptitude tests, they performed worse than if they had not been reminded of their race at all. These findings are based on what is known as stereotype threat, a self-consuming concern that one will be evaluated based upon negative stereotypes. This could be things like self-doubt and self-monitoring, hijacking your working memory, impairing your performance, impairing your ability to pay attention, and things like this, all because you are worried about potentially being stereotyped or being judged negatively because of existing stereotypes in your society. Critics note that stereotype threat doesn't account fully for aptitude score differences between African American and white individuals, but it does give context as to why women score higher on math tests when there's no men present, or why women's chess play drops sharply when they think they are playing against a male opponent. Telling students they probably won't succeed also functions as a stereotype that can erode performance. This type of speech can lead to students detaching their self-esteem from academics to prevent themselves from being hurt and look for recognition elsewhere through things like art, through things like sports, through other areas of their life. One experiment that really tested this out assigned African American 7th graders to write for 15 minutes about their most important values. In a time before students will really begin detaching, because if they do, most students begin detaching around that high school 8th grade period. This simple exercise had the apparent effect of boosting their semester grade point average by a 0.26, which doesn't seem like a lot, but is statistically significant, especially whenever you consider the replication of this experiment being that they increased their grades by 0.34. Now, with that in mind, with everything we've said in mind, what can we realistically conclude about aptitude tests and bias? These tests are indeed biased, in one sense, in that their purpose is meant to discriminate amongst individuals. We want to determine high scores and low scores so we can figure out who needs assistance. But the tests aren't also not biased, in the sense that their purpose is to reduce discrimination by reducing reliance on subjective criteria for school and job placement. Now, in this respect, our goal for test of mental ability should be threefold. First, we should recognize the benefits of such testing to enable schools to realize who needs assistance, what people would most benefit from early intervention. Second, we shouldn't misinterpret intelligence scores as literal measures of worth. These are not literal measures of a person's worth and potential and should not be treated as such. Finally, third, we must remember that general intelligence test sample is important, but it only reflects one aspect of a person's competence. Our practical intelligence, our emotional intelligence, those things matter too, as do other forms of creativity, of talent, and of character. Because there's a lot of ways of being successful, our differences are more variations of human adaptability than any form of lack. Finally, life's greatest achievements result not only from can-do abilities, but also from will-do motivation. It's not just one of these. It's not just motivation or intelligence that will make someone succeed, but competence and diligence, both together, lead to accomplishment. But with that, some last things before we end the year. Thank you all so much for being amazing students. You guys have been wonderful and are a class that I look forward to seeing and talking to every week. You all have done amazingly this year, even in the face of extreme circumstances, so give yourself a round of applause, give yourself a pat on the back. You guys have done wonderfully. Wonderfully. Thank you for making my first year as a teacher just that so much brighter. If there's any assignments you'd like to turn in before the end of the year, please do so as soon as possible. If you find checking ThinkWave that you're missing anything, or if you need to turn in things, the final cutoff to do so is going to be Friday, May 22nd, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. That's Friday, May 22nd at 11:59 p.m. ThinkWave will be closing later on this year for me to be able to change things. So I need time to be able to grade the assignments that are turned in, which is why I'm giving a cutoff final day to turn things in. Please try to do so as soon as possible, but if you really need the time, the final date is that Friday, May 22nd. If you don't have a class with me next year, please don't hesitate to stop by and say hi. I'd love to see you again. I'd love to catch up and get to talk with you guys again, see where life has taken you so far. So if you don't have a class with me next year, please don't hesitate to stop by and say hi. I'd love to see you again. I hope you'll continue exploring psychology, and I hope that this class has given you an interest in the subject that you'll continue to ask questions of the subject, that you'll continue to explore it even as you go on in your daily lives. But with that, I really do hope you guys have an amazing summer. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this course. I will see you guys next August. Have an amazing summer, and I will talk to you then. Bye-bye.